Hey everybody, Attorney Somm here. Welcome back. In a lot of my Instagram reviews, I oftentimes end up discussing my approach to decanting or aerating a wine. As a result, many of you have been asking me questions about how long I would decant a particular wine and how much air a particular wine may need. So in this video, I'm going to be discussing decanting, aeration, which wines can benefit from these techniques, and also provide some guidance concerning how long you should be aerating particular wines. There are two potential benefits to decanting. First, it's a technique to remove sediment from wines. As wines age, they tend to develop a lot of sediment, which can be unpleasant if it's included in your glass. So one significant purpose of decanting is to remove or separate the sediment from the wine. And so to do that, you pour the wine carefully from the bottle in the decanter, usually using a light source so that you can see the sediment and make sure that you trap it in the shoulder and that it doesn't go into the decanter along with a good wine. Of course, a secondary benefit to decanting is that it can aerate the wine. Aeration can help improve the taste and aromas of a wine. In the case of younger wines, for example, it can soften some of the tannins, which can be pretty fierce, especially with some hearty, robust wines like Cabernet or even some Italian wines that have lots of fierce tannins. And of course, with older wines, you can get some funky aromas. Some of these wines are not particularly vibrant or expressive when you first pour them. They need some time to open up, and in many instances, they can put on weight, as they say. They flesh out a little bit more, and they just generally become more expressive and more enjoyable wines. The most dramatic example I can recall of a decant improving was a wine, and by decant, in this instance, I mean aeration, was with the 1991 Beringer Private Reserve Napa Cabernet. This particular wine, I opened it around 4 o'clock on a Friday. There were some friends around. Several of them were sommeliers, and we each tried the wine. We smelled it, tasted it, and were very concerned about whether it was a flawed bottle or not. Almost everyone thought it was a hopeless situation and that the bottle was flawed. But there was one collector who had had the bottle before. He recommended that we just open another bottle and leave it alone for a few hours and then check back on it later on. So having nothing to lose, that's exactly what we did. And then by about 7:30, this wine had evolved dramatically and actually became the wine of the night. It had gone from being kind of funky and shut down to being just beautifully expressive with gorgeous Cabernet fruit and a classic Napa profile, and was really a sensational wine. And so that's the most dramatic example I can think of where a wine just completely evolved over the course of a few hours and greatly benefited from the aeration. So it definitely pays to be patient. At the same time, however, oftentimes you want to hit the ground running and you don't have time to wait a couple hours before you start enjoying the wine. To avoid this situation myself, I'll oftentimes open a bottle of wine either at home or at work and then let it sit in the decanter for a couple hours before I go to a tasting or a dinner. Unfortunately, I forgot something very important. Specifically, I forgot to mention one of my favorite tricks when waiting for a wine to decant or aerate. And that is, namely, if I'm just starting out for the night and I haven't had a chance to aerate a wine yet, I'll open both the champagne and my red wine. I'll put my red wine in the decanter and let it aerate, and then I'll start with the champagne. By the time the champagne is gone, the red wine is ready to go. It works like a champ. If you're short on time, one thing you can do is pour it into the decanter and then rinse the bottle out, let it dry out and get the water out of it, but then pour it back into the bottle and then put the cork in and then take it with you. While it won't be quite as good as letting it sit in the decanter for the appropriate amount of time, it will definitely give it a head start, and it will definitely be a lot more enjoyable earlier on than it would have been otherwise. You'll also be able to remove the sediment through this approach, and so you won't need to deal with that later on. Of course, there are these commercially available aerators that purport to accelerate this process. I tend to not use those. I'm a bit of an old school kind of guy, and so I typically like to just plan ahead with a decanter, but you certainly can use those if you enjoy them and if they work for you. So which wines can benefit from some air? Which wines would you aerate and which wines would you not? Oftentimes the wines that benefit the most from aeration are hearty, robust red wines, such as Cabernet, Syrah, Red Zinfandel, Malbec, and also Italian wines like Brunello, Barbaresco, Barolo, Aglianico, and the list goes on. It doesn't apply to just red wines, however. There are some white wines I enjoy decanting as well. For example, Aubert Chardonnay I've often found to benefit from a decant, as well as German and Austrian Rieslings. These wines can frequently benefit from at least 15 or 30 minutes in a decanter. Why wouldn't you just let the wine open up in the glass? Well, first, I do that for some wines. Typically with Burgundy, I'll take this approach, or with an Oregon Pinot Noir, or some other sort of a lighter red wine. This approach can also work if you're just sitting at home by yourself, enjoying a wine over the course of a night, or if you're at a tasting where you have 5 or 6 glasses in front of you, and you don't need to focus on any particular one of them at any one time, then you can just keep going back and forth throughout the course of the night, and time isn't such a big deal. The problem, however, is what about the situation where you're at dinner or you're at a tasting and there's 5 or 6 of you? You pour that wine in the glass and you get pretty much 1 glass or maybe slightly more than 1 glass. But if that wine is going to take 2 hours to open up, your dinner's going to be gone by the time it opens up. That's especially true if you wait to order it until you get your entrees. In that instance, the wine is going to be long gone before it's even close to its full potential, which is kind of a shame. And so when people ask me why I don't just let the wine open up in the glass, I oftentimes respond by saying, perfect is good enough. And then I can use the example from the Beringer Private Reserve. If we would have taken that approach then, and then just let it open up in the glass, we would have consumed that wine probably long before the 3 hours were up, and we would have never experienced it at its full potential. How long does it take to properly aerate a wine? Well, this will vary by the wine. Oftentimes with the white wines, though, it takes a lot less time, probably just 15 or 30 minutes. With the red wines, if it's a younger red wine, like a Cabernet or a Syrah, or even something like Vega Sicilia that's 20 years old or less, those sorts of wines can benefit from a long decant and are also not going to be hurt by a decant. You almost can't give it too much air. Oftentimes these wines can even be better the second day than they were the first. And if you find a wine where you drank about half of it the first day, cork it, and then try it again the second day, and you enjoyed it more the second day, that's definitely a wine that can benefit from heavy aeration. When would I not decant a wine? Well, with certain older bottles in particular, you need to be very careful because some of these wines can fall off or fade rapidly. This is particularly true for wine that's maybe from the 1960s or 1970s. Oftentimes people will get out a Bordeaux or a Burgundy that's this old and will have some sediment. So you do need to potentially worry about the sediment. But to deal with that problem, rather than decanting it, which may accelerate its aeration and cause it to fall off even faster, what I like to do is pour it directly into a glass, but through a screen or a filter that can catch any sediment and make sure that doesn't find its way into your glass. That way you have the best of both worlds. You can let it open up in the glass and make sure it doesn't fade too quickly, but also remove the sediment. The other thing I'll say about aeration, it's a little bit like a haircut. You want to take a conservative approach because you can always do more. What I like to do is first taste the wine, pour it in the glass, make sure it's sound, and then after that, I'll pour it in the decanter, and then I'll check back on it every 30, 45 minutes or so and see how it's progressing. Once it gets to the point where I think it's ready to go, then we can start in on it at that point. Or if I'm concerned that it's an older bottle that may fade, and that doesn't need any additional air, then I'll pour it back in the bottle so it doesn't get too much air. And that works well also. But the main thing to keep in mind is not to get too caught up with it. This is supposed to be fun. If the worst that happens is that you drink wine a little bit too soon before it's reached its full potential, that's not the end of the world. And you should just enjoy it and learn from the experience and then know that you want to give that wine a little bit more air the next time you open it. I do think, however, that many wines can benefit from a decant. In particular, when you go to an Italian restaurant, a lot of those wines are very, very tannic. And while the food can help to offset the tannins, I still like to order my red wine immediately when I sit down, along with my white and my water, and then get the red wine put in the decanter as soon as possible. That way, about an hour later, it will have a good head start, and then you can let it open up in the glass thereafter. So that's oftentimes worked for me at Italian restaurants in particular. I hope you enjoyed this video. If it was helpful, please go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next one. I come out with videos like this one at least once a week. Until then, drink well.